All right, so what I want to do here is um, show you how to do quilting in the hoop. Basically, this is the design that I digitized and showed you how to digitize. And I'm going to show it off and I'll kind of explain as I go. I've already put the first two rows down. You just put the fabric down in the place where it goes, and you let the machine sew it down, and then you trim off around the edges, and they'll be raw edges, but those will be covered by either a satin stitch or a stem stitch. I'm going to be using a stem stitch. So it's piecing, but on top of fabric. So there's a backing fabric and stabilizer in the hoop, and you could also put your batting and backing fabric underneath the hoop, or at later stage after you have the background fabric all down, when you go to do the top appliques, you can float a backing fabric and batting underneath the hoop. But I'm not doing that here. I'm just going to make the main fabric. So I've just sewn down another piece, and I'm going to put down two pieces and then trim them off. It's not good to do all of the pieces. You need to trim as you go, at least, but you don't have to trim every single piece unless it's in the way of the next one. So this is a sky section, and so I'm using blues. And I'm not a quilter, so I don't have a lot of fabric. Mostly what I have are brocades, which would not really go for this kind of a quilt or quilt piece. So I'm using some scraps that I had, some pieces of jelly roll that is left. It's not difficult to do a quilt in this way. Do the sections in the hoop and then sew the sections together, either the pieces themselves, or if you have the batting and the backing on, sew those together too. Just block quilts. I have made a few quilts in the past, large applique quilts, a couple of piece quilts. It's not something that I do very often. The two or three times that I've done it was usually because I was teaching some other girls how to do quilting. So that strip that I put down just now was a little bit too short, so I pieced another piece of fabric in there. Not the wisest thing to do, but I'm not going to be really using this in a quilt. This is just what I call a sew off, testing a pattern to see what needs to be changed in it. So I've trimmed those two pieces down, and this is what it looks like so far. This piece usually is something that I would make notes on and put in a binder with other things that I have, and just to to remind me how to do something, or for a class. If I used to teach digitizing classes, and having things like this, people like to do projects. So this would be a project. The jelly roll pieces are kind of pressed. Some of the other pieces that I'm using won't be pressed, and it probably would have been better to have pressed them first. And if I was doing this as a quilt, really intending to make a quilt, I would have pressed them. But as I say, this is just a learning experience. See, this piece I'm using now is not pressed. So you have the blue pieces in the sky, and you have the green pieces for the hills, and then the lower section is the field where the wheat is. And in the design, I marked the sections that are going to have green fabric with green threads, and blue fabric with blue threads, and yellow fabric or brown fabric with yellow threads. And then the wheat I marked with like gold threads, gold or yellow or orange or something like that, so that I know what colors I need to put down. It doesn't really matter, whether it's a dark green or light green. It just needs to be green. So now I'm going to trim it off. This kind of quilting, you can't take it out of the hoop until you're all done, because you'll never get it back in the hoop right. So you have to do all your work. You're cutting, you're piecing all this without taking off the hoop. Without taking it out of the hoop. You can take the hoop off the machine, but you can't take it out of the fabric out of the hoop. So you have to cut it all down here. You want to trim it pretty close. Within, like a 1/16 would be better. 1/16, eighth to a 1/16 of an inch. A 1/16 inch would be the best. Because I'm going to be using a stem stitch to cover this. A satin stitch, you might be able to get away with a little bit wider. Excuse me. Not trimming it quite so close. Now, if I did this again or in another design, I would probably first, using maybe a black thread or any kind of thread, excuse me, any kind of thread that you could see, I would probably sew the lines where the fabric goes, just so that I would know exactly how big a piece of fabric I need. And I wouldn't have picked a narrow one back there, because I would have been able to lay it down and measure it and see that it didn't fit. That's probably something I would do in the future, is just have it do right on the stabilizer or on the background fabric, mark lines for where the edges of the fabric is going to be, so that I can, when I can lay the fabric down over those lines and know if it's going to fit. That would be especially helpful if it's not a design you've used for a while and you don't remember how big the sections are. I'm going to have to use the same green, another green that I've already used again because I don't have that many green fabrics. Now I'll trim off those two. It's sew a little, cut, trim a little, sew a little more, cut, trim a little more. Applique scissors are really handy for this kind of thing, which is what I'm using there. You can just hold the fabric up and cut right very close to the edge. Now I'm at the brown area, the field area. And again, I don't have a lot of brown fabric. I think I have only two pattern, there, two cotton fabrics that have some brown in it. So, and I think there's 3 sections, so I'll have to use one twice. It's nice having that um, magna hoop because it's so flat. Even though you have to work up near the edge of the hoop isn't so very high. The bad thing about it is though is it is magnetic and it likes to grab the scissors when you're close to the edge. And yes, you probably do waste more fabric doing it this way than if you cut out every single little piece. But this kind of design is usually made from waste fabrics that you can't use for anything else. Just one more piece. There's several ways to do quilting in the hoop. This is one way, and I'll probably show you a couple of others. It went off the fabric there, or the bobbin thread did, so I'm backing it up and sewing that part again. Now it's going, I'm trimming off the last of the fabric. Now it's going up to the top because the next thing that's going to sew are the stem stitch lines that separate each of that cover the raw edges of each of of those pieces of fabric. And it's going to sew one blue color for all the blue sky pieces, and it'll sew green for all the heels and brown for the bottom, whatever color thread I want to put into it. But it's not going to change fabric for each piece. It's going to do all the sky pieces and then all the heel pieces and then all the ground pieces, because that's the way I designed it to do it. I don't like change threads very often, so blue's blue, green's green, ground is ground. So I'm going to put in some blue thread. I decided to sew that where it had missed that one area. I decided to sew that whole line again just to make sure that it was sewn. So I sewed all the fabric down with just a neutral color thread. I could have used white, but I think I used like an ecru color. You could change the color for each piece, but it's not really necessary because you're going to now go in and put thread on top of that thread. So picking a neutral color is that will kind of disappear underneath the other thread was what I decided to go with. And because this was a sew off, I was using up old thread that was which, like fabric, you often have a lot of thread you need to get rid of. Thread rots after a while if you don't use it up. It has only a certain amount of shelf life. You can extend it by keeping it in the freezer, but who has that much room in their freezer? Now, stem stitch sews much faster than satin stitch. It's because it's more open than satin stitch. But it does a nice job of covering the raw edges. The background fabric I chose to use there is a really pale blue-green. Now I'll change out to green thread. so I can do the hills. If anybody has an idea how to use plastic bobbins, I've got tons of them. I like to figure out something that can be done with them. Maybe some kind of crafts. Maybe they can be used for making something. I don't know. Old wooden spools used to be used for all kinds of things. They're hard to even find now. I know people make jewelry out of them. I don't know if you can make any jewelry out of bobbins, plastic bobbins or not. I buy them by the gross. Rather than wind a bobbin, I go through so many bobbins that I buy a gross at a time. So then I have all those empty bobbins. And now it's ready for brown. You just, like with most digitizing, you have to keep in mind when you're planning it what has to be done first, what has to be done second, what has to be done third. So in this case, it was the background fabric had to be sewn down. Then the edges of that had to be covered with the stem stitch before the next set of appliques could be put on top of the background. That way they would cover up the stem stitch, because if you did the stem stitch afterwards, it would go right through those appliques. So you have to keep in mind, what's working from the back forward. So we have background, we're just finishing off the stem stitch, and then we'll have to do the things that are on the background. We've seen 2 mistakes so far that I'll have to fix. It shouldn't have sewn that border edge, and it wanted to sew it on both sides, so that's 2 mistakes. And then I also want to put down that first sewing to show where the pieces go. Seems like every time I sew a design, I make changes to it. All right, so now the stem stitch is all down. So the next thing it's going to do is the hairs that come out from the wheat. And I'm going to do that with the brown thread, so I didn't change the thread. Now, usually with quilting, you can, one of the last things you do is to go over the background and quilt it. It depends upon what kind of quilt you do, whether you do that at all. Sometimes people just knot it together at the corners, but sometimes the quilt calls for actual quilting on top of it. This one, I could do that. The stem stitch, if I had had the batting and the background under there, the stem stitch would have gone through all of them and quilted them together. But I'm just doing a top right here. But once the fabric was down and I went to do the stem stitch, that would have been a good time to float some fabric and batting underneath it. Or I could have done it right now before I started doing the hairs on the wheat, because you see it going around, and it's doing a nice quilting job on it. And then you can imagine if that were sewing through several layers. On the next one I show you, I will put some batting and fabric behind it to show you what I'm talking about, in case you're not familiar with quilting. You can make squares like this and sew all the squares together to make a top, and then add the batting and the backing and then quilt everything. Or you can make each block with the batting and the backing and then sew all the blocks together. That's another way to quilt. Now it's got the hairs for the wheat down. Now I need to sew down the wheat. And there's 3 ears of wheat, and I'm going to do them each in a different gold fabric. So it'll start with the farthest gold, the piece that's farthest away, and work towards the one that's closest. So I'll use the darkest gold fabric for the farthest one. Again, this fabric should have been ironed, but it's also metallic and therefore would have shrunk and probably would have been more trouble than it's worth. So especially for something like this, which I'm just doing as a practice piece. Now I'll have to trim this down before I can put the other ones on. So there's the first ear of wheat. Now take another gold, and this has got a lot of fraying at the edge, so I have to get that out of the way. And that one's ready to be trimmed. And one more wheat, which is the closest one, so that's going to be a bright gold. Now with all the wheat sewn down, the next thing is to do the stem stitch over the edges of the wheat and the lines inside of it too that separate the kernels of the wheat. That's not what they're called. What are they called? It escapes me right now, I know. But and then also the stitch around the edge. Now, if you were attaching this to another quilt block, you would probably not put the stitch around the edge. If you were sewing quilt blocks together, you may or may not, depending upon how you were going to sew them together. But again, since I'm going to put it around the edge. This is going in a binder anyway. And it's good to put it in the design, and then you can just skip it. As long as you put it as a separate color, you can always skip it when you get there. You don't have to sew off everything in a design if you choose not to do it. If I hadn't wanted to put the stem stitch on the background fabrics, I could have skipped them all and left the raw edges. Sometimes it looks nice. I'm going to use black thread for the wheat just because it'll show off better off on the gold. I'm just doing some trimming along the edges because I plan to put, I'm going to use the same trim for the wheat as same trim for the borders I'm using for the wheat. So rather than stop and trim, then I'm going to trim now. I like to sew without jump stitches, so I don't have to trim anything, even though it's right now it seems to be it's set that it's cutting the threads. That's why it moves away and then moves back again. It cut the thread. I generally don't have that turned on. So because I don't like the jump stitches, it's going to sew around the outside edge with the stem stitch, and then it's going to switch to line switch and do the inside of the wheat, and then continue down the stem on the other side with the stem stitch. that's the end of the wheat, so now it just needs to do the border. And there you go. And that's the finished design. It's a little dark. I'm going to go turn the light on. So it might be something you might want to try, digitizing a quilt in the hoop block.